Whenever there's conflict, I recommend that you go to a higher level, one level up, with the person that you're having the conflict with, and look and come up with an agreement of how you should be with each other. In other words, let's say you and I have a disagreement. Rather than being caught in the anger of that disagreement, to go above and you should say, how do we disagree? How should we disagree? And make that a practical modus operandi. That's what we do, and then there's also then the ways we do it. So the ways we do it are certain things. First, to know that decision-making is a two-step process. There's first taking in, and then there's deciding. The capacity to take in the other person's point of view. We have something like the 2-minute rule. Can I have 2 minutes? Then that person has the 2 minutes to say what they want. Having those kinds of protocols, there are a number in the room where there's curiosity. So these protocols in place that you practice are fair.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because as a young entrepreneur, I struggled to keep my business going. I had no friends, I had no mentors, I had no role models. And the thing that saved me was learning from the success stories of famous entrepreneurs. And in their stories, I got motivation, and I also got strategies for what I could do to grow my business and not stay stuck. And I still need their stories for motivation today. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Ray Dalio, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy. Rule number 2 is leverage yourself.
There's a life cycle, right? Your teens, your 20s, your 30s, and so on. And every phase is a little bit different, or quite a bit different. And people have asked me in their 20s, what is good advice for their 20s? And I gave that. And now I've gotten some questions of what is good advice for people in their 40s. And so I'll just pass along some thoughts. Okay, that's your midlife, that in history. And when you look at happiness, that's measured as the toughest part of life. It's a midlife. They talk about midlife crisis. And it's a difficulty because you have to juggle your work and your family. And it's not just your immediate family, maybe your parents, your children. You're trying to be successful in life. And you find out maybe that life is tougher than you expected. And so that midlife crisis is the key thing. Okay, what would I recommend? First of all, I recommend for every phase of your life, meditation. If you can meditate and you have the calmness and the equanimity to look at that, I think that that's an important thing. And then I think also that if you think about the relationships that you're in, that then may be more strained, to differentiate those relationships. Who are the people that you want to be around, and how do you work with them to get you through those issues? And then on the issue of there's too much to do, too much work, and think how you get leverage. Think about how you get the more out of an hour than you did before. It's all a matter of leverage. If you know how to leverage yourself well, then you're going to be able to get more life out of life. So don't think it's just a matter of a choice. I have to give up this or give up that. Think about how you can do the leverage. A lot of these things are dealt with in my book, Principles for Life and Work, so I can't cover them all. But I would say that that's the expectation. You're going to go through that, probably the challenging. Savor the joys in life, meditate, and I also think about how you prioritize and organize yourself so that you go through that in the best possible way.
Rule number 3 is look at the big picture.
Reading your book, The Changing World Order, you can see how prophetic a lot of the content that you put in there is. So I was kind of hoping we could start with the big picture, the global macro view for you today.
Yeah, it's like watching the same movie happen over and over again when you read history. So I learned in my life that many of the things that surprised me didn't happen in my lifetime, but they happened many times before. And there were 3 big things that are taking place, big forces that are happening in our lifetimes that happened many times before. And they are the creation of an enormous amount of debt and the printing of money to service those debts. And so the economic consequences, inflation and what it means for growth and tight money and all of that. The second is the levels of internal conflict are the highest since the 1930 to 45 period and other times before. Lots of internal conflict, the emergence of populism of the left and the right, the largest wealth gaps since the 1930 to 45 period. And so a lot of internal conflict fighting, populism on the left, populism on the right, that's threatening to our system. And number three is the external conflict, which some people call, the great powers conflict, the rising of a great power to challenge an existing great power and to challenge the world order. The way it works is you usually have a big disagreement, you have a fight, you have a war. The winners of the war create the new system, the new order. And that happened in 1945. And then they're a dominant power and they sort of set the rules. And then there's the emergence of the other power and that conflict. And so those three things, each one of them, the last time they happened in this magnitudes was 1930 to 45. And when they come together like that, it's sort of a perfect storm. And so I needed to study what happened before. Because these rises and declines take place on average about 75 years, give or take about 50. These ups and downs. I needed to go back about 500 years and watch them. And I watched the same thing happen over and over again for the same reasons.
Rule number 4 is understand inflation.
When there was the position that interest rates got a lot below the inflation rate, you're losing buying power. There's no good reason to own that. And there's a change in psychology because before there was, I own bonds. The bonds go up in value as interest rates go down. So I'm getting a price appreciation, even though I'm getting, let's say a low interest rate, but inflation isn't a problem until it's a problem. Then when it's a problem, because they print so much money and they put it out, then inflation goes up and a light bulb goes off. That light bulb used to be, okay, how much am I earning? Okay, I'm not earning much, but it's okay. The price of the bond or whatever's gone up, but anyway, I'm holding it and it's safe. And then people realize it's not safe, because I'm losing money to inflation. So now you have the central bank wanting to rectify that imbalance by, real interest rates were minus 1.7%.
Meaning that inflation was chipping away at your buying power.
Yes, if I look at inflation index bonds as an indicator, or other indicators, I'm losing percentage points to inflation by holding that bond. And then people realize that, well, you don't want to do that. And then the other side of it was you want to buy and borrow and buy stuff because, money's free. So companies borrow and buy stuff and individuals borrow and buy houses because interest only loans on the houses. Okay, I can buy a house, I can buy an apartment. And so, but that creates the imbalance where it's terrible to be a lender and a creditor, and it's good to be a borrower and do that. So that imbalance takes place. It produces inflation. And then when it produces inflation and so on, and then you say, I don't want to own these things anymore. And then, also the Federal Reserve says, I better fight inflation. They change things. And so by raising interest rates to levels in which it goes from minus 1.7% in inflation index bonds to plus 1.7%, and it makes it and it raises the short-term interest rates, real interest rates much higher, then lo and behold, all the people who did all those things get hurt. Okay, they borrowed, they bought the bonds, they bought all of those things and all of those debt instruments, and also companies. Look at the companies that are affected. Because yields got so low, tech companies and others, those who have a dream, they don't have to necessarily make profits. They're selling a dream, and the money's got to be invested. And so you see all of that change radically when that tightening of monetary policy.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5 is start with you.
What is that? Those 3 things, money and credit, wealth and political gaps, and the rise of China. What is someone like myself or some 30, 40, 45-year-old, 20-year-old, what should they do with that information? What should they be aware of? How should they apply it? Does it apply to people in America, general America, or is it only applied to the wealthy? What should we be thinking about?
No, it affects everybody. It affects, we know, let's start with ourselves. Most importantly, forget about the outside thing. Can we be healthy and strong? And what do we need to do? To know that you have to be in it together. If we can row in the same direction, okay? If we can have thoughtful disagreement and get past that, if we can be in it together, like the wealthy and the poor, and if you figure it out, and I know it sounds so difficult, but at the same time, if you read history and you see what happens when it's not, when you have a civil war, we could be on the brink of a civil war. That sounds so crazy, but the truth is, in most countries, in almost every century, there was a civil war or a revolution. Some form of civil war or revolution. So it's almost inevitable that we're going to have something. Okay, you either resolve it or you start fighting so badly that you really do terrible things to each other.
Until you resolve it, yeah.
Well, once you cross a certain line, there's no coming back. Okay, because you do the damage, you demonize, and that person's such an enemy, or that class of people is such an enemy that the communication's gone and the fight. Well, you see this in politics today. In other words, is there a respect for the system and a mutual respect of trying to resolve these types of things, or will they go to any lengths to win? Because a constitution or law will only carry you to so far, okay? There has to be an element of respect for it, right? If you think about the presidential election, it's quite something that we as a country, as a people, when somebody might win the popular vote, somebody else wins the electoral vote, there's not even an argument. Like in other countries, you might say, those who had the popular vote would say, what the hell, I've won the popular vote, I think it matters, and somebody says electoral vote and so on. Okay, there's not a question about that. Okay, now when you start to say, okay, is it this vote or that vote or this thing or that, and how far are you willing to go to fight, and does the rules matter? When you start to cross that line and you do harm, you hurt, and you alienate, Then you go to accelerate this process. And people should know what that looks like, how terrible it is. So maybe if they know what it looks like and how terrible it is, and they can empathize a little bit. But I see people don't see it. I'm living in Greenwich, Connecticut. Connecticut has the highest per capita income in the country, and it's got the largest wealth gap. Most of the people in Connecticut are pretty poor.
Really?
I mean, some cases, very poor.
Huh.
Oh, I'll give you an example. This is the community my wife works to help. High school students. 22% of the high school students in Connecticut are either disengaged or disconnected. What that means is disengaged means they have an absentee rate which is greater than 25% and they're failing classes.
They don't show up to class.
That's right. They show up, 3/4 of the time and they're failing. Or that's disengaged. Disconnected is they don't know where they are. They've dropped out of school. 22%, 1 in 5. So school is not working for them. And they're in desperately poor areas. Like, okay, we had the coronavirus. And so her efforts and our efforts are philanthropic. That's what got her involved. They don't have computers. They don't have connectivity. They have problems getting food. They get food in school. They need the food in school because they don't have adequate food. Okay. And this is Connecticut and it's right up the road. So we bought these kids, 60,000 kids, computers. And then we're trying to get connectivity and so on. And you start to see this. Okay. This is the same world. Now, I live in one neighborhood with my community, and then there's the other. They don't understand each other. They haven't lived there. They haven't empathized. And in fact, there are resentments on both sides, right? Like the people in my community, they don't feel that they're very rich by comparison to those other people, but also to take care of their families, to educate them. They have their own challenges, the work-life balance and so on. They have their financial insecurities and so on. So that's what they're focused on. And then they might think, oh, these other people, they're not taking care of themselves. Why don't they pull themselves up by the bootstraps? Do you know what it's like to be a kid growing up in that neighborhood and trying to, what are you talking about? You can't pull yourself up from, there's a problem. There's not enough food. There are gangs. Even walking to school past neighborhoods that are gang shootings and and there are not enough police to do it. Okay. So these two worlds exist. And then the others say, here we are, and you're walking around with your fancy cars and your, fancy clothes and so on. And we're suffering. I mean, come on. And so they don't understand each other and so on. We have to get past this. We have to be in it together, I think. Otherwise, we're going to kill each other.
Rule number 6 is practice radical transparency.
Let's say an organization goes through a calamity and there's a trust issue in the organization. How does the company go about rebuilding the trust within employees?
Well, again, I think radical truthfulness and radical transparency is the means of doing it. What I did, what my experience would be, if you have radical transparency, so literally every crisis I was in, every situation I was in, I would have a camera in that discussion as we looked at the pros and cons of the issue. So everybody could see that the pros and cons of the discussion. So there's no spin. If you have a trust issue if it's hidden behind the scenes, I think. And with that radical transparency, so everybody could see, just imagine what it would be like here, okay? For whatever issue, that you could see how people are making decisions. Literally, weighing the pros and cons and seeing how they are real. And it could be anything from the top of the organization to just even somebody firing somebody else. So was it done well? That radical transparency, and then coming out of it and writing principles as to why did you handle it that way, and then putting those principles out so that everybody could debate that principle or look at that principle, not in an enormous time-consuming way, but in an effective way. So, and then having an idea meritocratic way where you look at that and you say, okay, that decision was made that way. Maybe that's not the way I would do it, but I now understand the thinking behind it. Because if you don't have that kind of thing, then there's alienation. If you don't have trust and you don't have an appreciation, then increasingly you build an organization in which there's a we and them, you know? There's those people who are making the decisions and you don't really understand it and you just have to sort of go along with it, and then that becomes a source of tension, and then there are factions and all that, and there's no resolution. You have to have resolution and get past it. So, you know, the radical truthfulness and the radical transparency brings trust. It also means that bad stuff, it's tough for bad stuff to happen because bad stuff happens in the dark.
It's true.
Right?
Yeah.
You make it radically transparent and everybody can bring it up, then everybody owns it. Radical transparency is a very effective tool in terms of building trust and putting things to the light. Believe me, none of this is perfect, but it's certainly been miraculous for us.
Rule number 7 is always be prepared.
There are short-term cycles that build up to create a long-term cycle. So, for example, we're used to what's commonly called the business cycle or the short-term debt cycle, in which there's a recession when there's economic weakness and low inflation, and then the central bank provides credit, and that stimulates activity, and then you have the pickup and the good time in the economy, but then it raises inflation and tightness and so on, and then they create tight money, and then you go through the contraction again and so on. So since 1945, there have been 12 and a half of those cycles. On average, they're about 7 years long, give or take about 3 years. So if you say, okay, where are we in that cycle? We're in the business cycle. We're about halfway through. We're in the part of the cycle where the tightening of monetary policy to fight inflation begins to cause the cracks. And that's where we are. Okay. Now those add up to a big cycle because debt rises relative to incomes through that because everybody wants the higher up. And so they just keep doing that. And so we have a lot of debt assets and debt liabilities. We think of there's a debt that you owe, but one man's debt is another man's assets. And so you have to keep interest rates high enough that it compensates for inflation for holding it. Because if you don't, nobody's going to then want to lend and you have a problem. But you have to have interest rates not so high that they crack the economy. And so when you have debt, a lot of debt assets and a lot of debt liabilities, having that balancing act is not easy. And so because we had the imbalance, the central banks of the world had to come in there and be buyers. They had to print money and buy that debt to make a balance at an acceptable interest rate. So we have that problem. That produced inflation, and we have the financial problem. Now that's connected also to what's happening in the world order, because the United States and China, most importantly, are approaching a war, the greater risk of war, and also Russia is in that there have been supply lines, supply chains have been broken, and supply lines and so on, and that has worsened this set of circumstances for reasons having to do with geopolitical and so on. So we are in that spot.
Rule number 8 is don't fear failure.
Failure is a part of the learning process, right? What's the risk of failure? What, you'll be embarrassed, or risk of failure? How do you distinguish failure from learning? In your whole life, failure implies that it stopped, that the game stops, right? If it's part of you're failing and then you learn, then that learning is part of the moving forward. right? So that is what the process is like. Fail, learn, move forward, and constantly do that because you're cutting edge. You're going where people haven't been before in inventiveness.
Rule number 9 is make smart investments.
Wouldn't that be really risky to have exposure to China, like whether you are like a Wall Street firm, an investment firm, or even a business that operates over there? Wouldn't that be a major risk to think about if you are on the brink of a war?
Yes, and it's having implications, but there's it's kind of a two-sided sword. The question is, what is the magnitude of the exposure? Because let's say the more probable thing is you don't have a war, and then you have these differences in their technologies and so on. But you're definitely seeing, just like there's a perceived risk in bonds now, U.S. bonds in the world, there's a perceived risk of being in China. And you're seeing the neutral countries that are doing well, like India, and countries let's call it the ASEAN countries, which are, Singapore and Indonesia there and different countries. You're seeing them benefit as there's movement for businesses in various ways to those countries that are not involved in this war. As a generalization, if I was to make a big sweeping generalization, I would say one wants to invest in countries that have good finances, good income statement, balance sheet, earning more than they spend, and have good because they can withstand disruptions better financially, and they'll be more productive. That don't have big internal conflicts and are not in the risk of being in the war situation. So you see generally money going to those types of places.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is build financial security.
When we think about safety, we have to think about that as purchasing power, because a lot of people think if I put my money into a treasury bill, I get safety. Well, also look at whether that's giving you a return that's compensating for inflation. You as an individual should think about the total safety, including maybe that terrible scenario doesn't happen. Okay, that's what I'd like you to do. That's what I'd like you to do. And if you do that, you will come to a better balanced position. I want you to get balance. Okay, I want you to do certain things. I want you to have enough savings, whatever, to have security, to build the first level of, I think, investing, which is the same as savings, comes in tiers. Tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 on risk. And the first tier is, if everything goes wrong, I'm okay. And everything could be inflation, depression, anything, whatever it is. I lose my job. I whatever it is, I got that thing covered. Then your next level is, okay, what am I going to get the highest returns? What is my best bet? Okay, but start at that level. And then you said the other thing too, that it's not just the investment, it's where am I? Am I in the middle of a fight? Like, I don't want to be in the middle of a fight. Okay, what's it going to be like? So it does have geographic implications. I don't know, maybe it's the state or the state you go to, or the city you go to, or the country you go to, or whatever it is, and there are certain things you can do to say this one's going to be better than that one. if I'm making a decision, that after I make the decision, usually, or right at the time, if I pause and reflect, and I write my principle down. In other words, principle is sort of a recipe. What would I use how would I make that decision? And what are the criteria around it? I find that I make it much more clear. It becomes clearer, and it applies to the next thing that comes along. It'll be that way because everything happens over and over and over again. And I think people make the mistake of looking at just the one like it's the first one. They have the first problem of this sort, or the first child, or whatever it is. And this has been happening plenty of times. And so if you have the principles, I found that helped me think more clearly about it, and it helped me communicate better, like why. And so over the last 30 years or so, that's what I've done. I did it originally to communicate very well with the people I work with. I set up my company, and it was very important to have good communication. And then we could debate the principles. And so that's the process. I urge people to do that. There are many excellent decision makers, and I just wish that they wrote down their principles when this sets. So, for example, we'll be talking about Henry Kissinger, and his new book is going to come out with a book on leadership. And don't just describe the leaders, describe then what about them were the essential elements to make a good leader under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so if we think about that, then you begin to think in a principled way. And then when you start to think in a principled way, life becomes, it's so much easier to make decisions, and it's so much less confusing, because it's like coming up on a species and you say, okay, well, what species is it? Not just it's a thing. No, what species is it? And how do I deal with that species effectively? Mm-hmm. And so that's what that is. And so I encourage people to write it down. I wish anybody who's successful wrote down their principles or their recipes for making those types of decisions.
You have to know what you're going after. You can't have everything in the world, but you could have almost anything you want, but you can't have everything you want. If you go after your goals and they're clear, you have to know your goals. In 1968, the Beatles went to India and they meditated. And then I heard about it. And then in 1969 in New York, you can bring some flowers and you could do that, and you could learn how to meditate. And wow, I recommend. It's the best gift I could give.
You do it every day or every?
Almost yeah. I try to do it every day. I try to do it about twice a day. And if I could take a second to describe it, what it is it frees your mind of thought, and it takes you from a conscious state into your subconscious. And your subconscious is where creativity comes from, and equanimity and all of that. Like if you're calm and great ideas come to you. And when you have that equanimity, then as you're approaching everything, things are just the way they are, and you have to deal with them. And it's a little like being, in the ninja movies, it's a little bit like being the ninja, and everything seems slower and you can handle it better. Right. And you align your subconscious, which is where the emotions and also inspirations come from, with your conscious mind. And when they're aligned and you have that equanimity, it's a great thing.
I think the key is to think of reality as you're given. Reality is reality. And think of it as working like a machine. There are cause-effect relationships that make the realities around you. Okay, now, if you go above yourself and you look at that, how does that machine work? And then, how do I interact with that machine to get what I want? And you do that with an equanimity. Meditation also helped me a lot.
Yes.
I learned to meditate many years ago. If you have equanimity and you look at it above and you look at it with curiosity and you say, oh, I must not be interacting well with my reality, and how do I change it, and how does it work? It's a very powerful way of approaching life. My son in 2014 gave me a book by Joseph Campbell called Hero of a Thousand Faces. And basically he described that these things happen, everybody crashes, and then you're faced with that crash. And you either have an epiphany or you don't. You either walk off the field and say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, and you give up on that, going after your audacious goals, or you gain really humility. You how do you feel that you're going to be wrong? And so I think then that whole notion is, to come back with the finding the smartest people I could find who disagree with me. Also, I'm in the investment management business that you have to bet against the consensus. Otherwise, you can't make money because it's in the price. And you have to bet against the consensus and be right. Or as an entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur. I had to bet against the consensus and be right. And so to gain that humility was the thing. So you either get off the field or you learn.
You now use a lot of computer-related algorithms to help you navigate the market?
Yes. Algorithms are what we call them today. Equations is what we used to call them. And so you would write that down. And what I learned is by being clear, then I could tell how that decision would have worked in the past in all different environments. So it gave me a lot of perspective on making that decision. I could test it through the Great Depression and so on. And then I could find that if I use that same algorithm, I could take data from and have the computer make decisions in parallel with me. And so, this is what I recommend for everybody. I recommend they write down their principles and then realize that almost any of those principles can then be converted into algorithms. And so the computer was making decisions in parallel with me making decisions. That type of partnership between me and the computer, and also expressing the algorithms, was invaluable, not only in the quality of the decision making, but also the quality of the relationships that I had with the people I worked with. The average person who's listening, too many people, think that they can go into this very difficult zero-sum game of betting against the consensus and be right. You know what I mean? In other words, investor says, I'm going to go in the markets, I'm going to make money.
Betting against the consensus and be right.
Right, because the consensus is built into the price. Okay? That's what's think of it as like going to a horse race, and there's handicaps. Okay? You're not going to pick the best horse, and you're not going to pick the best company. A terrible company can be a better investment than a terrific company. A terrible company can be a better investment, just like the terrible horse can be a better investment, because the odds that are changing, like you go into that and that becomes the long shot. But because the long shot is going to pay off 25-1, right? If he comes in, that you could just as likely bet on the long shot as the leader, and it's going to be equally likely that you're going to make money, right? Otherwise the market would be doing the opposite. Well, the market is like that, right? In other words, if everybody believes that something's going to be terrific, okay, then everybody's betting on it, and its price is high. So it's not what's best necessarily. It's what's best relative to what's in the price, what's discounted.
Then you start your own company, right?
Yeah.
And it went incredibly well at the beginning.
1975. It was me, a guy I played rugby with, in my two-bedroom apartment.
Okay, and everything went well until it didn't go well.
That's right.
And did you then have to go borrow money from your father?
Yeah, so what happened was, it was a very small company, just, a handful of people. And I loved to trade the markets, and we did it for institutions. And then in 1979, 80, 81, I calculated that that the American banks had lent more money to foreign countries than the countries were going to get paid back. And I had this controversial view that the world, is going to be a big debt crisis. And Mexico defaulted in 1982. So very interesting, 1982. And when they defaulted, I got a lot of attention, and I thought we were going to have a terrible economic set of circumstances. And I could not have been more wrong.
It was exactly the opposite. In August, when they defaulted and other countries started to default, it was the exact bottom in the stock market. And so I had to let off everybody, and I was down to me, and I said to myself, well, am I going to have to put on a tie and go take the train in and go to Wall Street and so on? I couldn't bring myself to do that. And I was so broke that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to pay the bills. And this was the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, painful, but it was one of the best things that ever happened to me because it gave me the humility I needed to balance with my audacity. And then I needed to understand, how can I have the upside without having the downside? And then I understood the portfolio construction and risk management and so on and so forth. So that was my bottom, and that punch in the face, that experience was one of the best things that happened.
Did you pay your father back at some point?
The $4,000 plus.
He didn't want equity in Bridgewater? He didn't ask for that?
No, I think he was smarter than that.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. For 10 more amazing rules from Warren Buffett, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
I'm a bright guy who's terribly interested in what he does. I've spent a lifetime surrounding myself with people that bring out the best in me, and you don't need to be a genius in what I do. That's the good thing about it.